practice. Most people don't know, for example, that the very first International Women's Day, which is still commemorated all over the world every year on March 8th, that originated as a socialist holiday back in 1910 in New York City when the Socialist Party organized a massive Women's Day march celebrating the victory of one of the most bitter strikes in U.S. history, which was called at the time the uprising of the 20,000 very young, mostly immigrant garment workers in New York City. They organized a march through New York City afterwards, and in that march, they demanded higher wages and better working conditions for women workers, and also the right to vote. So, that's a proud socialist tradition that really is even recognized as such anymore. It's also generally accepted by most feminists and even many on the left that, we had the first wave of feminism that kind of, after the vote, women won the vote in the 1920s, and then there was pretty much nothing else happened until the late 60s when the quote-unquote second wave of feminism took place, the women's liberation movement. And that in between, there was virtually nothing happening. But the fact is that the women's liberation movement in the 1960s didn't just, drop out of the sky. It actually built upon concepts and politics that had begun developing over the decades that immediately preceded the 60s. Much of that framework was developed from inside the socialist movement. It might come as a surprise, for example, that the first reproductive rights movement in the United States was not in the 1960s, but in the first decades of the 20th century, organized as an underground illegal movement by women of the Socialist Party and also from the industrial workers of the world, the SP and then the IWW. At that time, even dispensing information about contraception was illegal in this country, and these activists faced regular police raids on their meetings, on their, in their homes, etc., and arrests. I mean, they spent a fair amount of time in jail as they were trying to help the large numbers of working class women who were living in poverty, dying from repeated pregnancies that they could do nothing about because contraception was illegal. Most of us have heard of Margaret Sanger, that's kind of who gets most of the credit for this activity. She started out as a socialist and she later converted to racist eugenics politics. But the truth is that the many other women radicals from the IWW and the Socialist Party received no recognition, and yet they maintained a lifetime of commitment to fighting for the right of women to control their own reproductive lives as part of the fight against women's oppression, very consciously. This is how one socialist birth control activist, her name was Antoinette Konikow, put it in her pamphlet in 1923. She wrote a pamphlet called Voluntary Motherhood. She said, quote, "Women can never obtain real independence unless her functions of procreation are under her own control," end quote. The dynamics of that early birth control movement really, bears striking similarity to the slogans and themes of the 1960s liberation movement, which, as we know, large numbers of women in the 60s were dying from the complications of having unsafe, illegal abortions. And their slogan, and it's still our slogan today, is our bodies, our lives, our right to decide. And that's really, there's a continuity there that isn't often recognized. So women veterans of the early 20th century socialist movements also played a key role in transmitting their commitment to what they then mostly called women's emancipation to a younger generation of women on the U.S. left. So there was attention being paid to women's liberation. During the Great Depression, that sort of next generation during the Great Depression played out the orientation in the process of the class struggle, because what was going on was a massive strike waves, sit-down strikes, factory occupations, etc. And one of the most important examples from the labor movement of the Great Depression is the momentous Flint sit-down strike during the winter of 1936-37, when you actually had Trotskyists, who were at that time in the Socialist Party, and members of the Communist Party, who in most other ways were not, they were on different sides of the battle in terms of the Soviet Union, but they worked together in brilliant cohesion to lead their strike against General Motors to victory. At that time, Socialist Party member Janora Johnson, later she became Janora Dollinger. At that time, she was 23 years old, and the wife of a striker, Kermit Johnson. She is the one who originally formed the Flint Women's Emergency Brigade. Now, while the Flint Women's Emergency Brigade was made up of strikers' wives, it was the farthest thing you can imagine from a typical women's auxiliary. They consciously called their organization as being made up of women, the women in the title, and not ladies. The women of the brigade wore the uniform of a red beret and an armband, and as the New York Times at the time described, not approvingly, they said that these women, quote, did not content themselves with passive resistance, but used clubs the size of baseball bats, whittled down at the end to make them easy to swing and handle, end quote. One of the emergency brigade's most clever tactics is what they called the sound car, which was, a car with a, megaphone attached to it. And they quickly dispensed the sound car whenever there was sign of trouble, because the occupiers are still inside the plant. So here comes the sound car rushing to the scene, and they would show up using the loudspeaker to direct pickets, because they could see everything. They could see the cops are coming this way, to let the pickets know what they should do. So the strikers would know exactly what tactics that they needed to use. A researcher named Janice Hassett, she described one episode. She said, GM police exchanged blows with the strikers and used clubs and tear gas to move them to the back of the plant. The emergency brigade, always ready for emergencies, was on hand and used their own clubs to break the windows and let air into the factory. So you can see how they were just as essential to winning that strike in the 30s. The Communist Party at that time was larger than any other left organization, and I'll call them the CP if that's okay. They were able to consistently deploy their members, their forces, to the struggle explicitly against racism, and made significant inroads at that time into building a multiracial organization. During that time, black communist women, for example, in Harlem, began to organize systematically among black working class women, including organizing against the high prices of the white-owned butcher shops that they were charging to the black working class clientele. In a demonstration of 1,000 in which flying squads, which is what they called their groups, because they would go from one place to another, black women and children marched and chanted, quote, prices of meat must come down. They demanded a 25% reduction in meat prices, and then teams of protesters would go into the white butcher shops to confront the white owners. Sometimes they stood on the tables and ripped off the prices of the meat and put on the price that they wanted instead. And believe it or not, by the end of one single day of doing this, almost 50 stores agreed to reduce their food prices by 25% in a huge victory. So these 1930s era struggles, they were led by socialists and communists. I do want to underscore that they did not attempt at that time to build a broader or more political movement for women's rights at that time. And the way Dollinger put it many years later, looking back, she said that at that time, a movement for women's liberation would have, in her words, been historically immature. She said, to give women a right to participate in discussions with their husbands, with other union members, with other women, to express their views, that was a radical change for those women at the time. So that was kind of how they approached it at that time. And the truth is that, and it's also kind of ironic, that it wasn't until the post-war era, post-World War II era in the 1940s and 50s, that the socialist and communist movements began to discuss much more seriously the theoretical issues of women's oppression and women's liberation. The reason why it's ironic is because that period was one of the single most reactionary periods in U.S. history. The post-World War II era of the late 40s and 50s was the era of McCarthyism, of anti-communism, in which thousands and thousands of socialists, liberals, you name it, lost their jobs or put in prison because of their involvement with socialist, anti-racist, anti-fascist, or even pro-labor organizations. The McCarthy era left the organized socialist left in complete disarray and marginalized until today from the working class movement, while the American media in the 50s dangled the promise of an American dream that workers could, hope to raise their standard of living, and if not them, at least their children would have a better life than them. But yet, it's important, I think, to understand the context, because the Second World War had set into motion other social forces that exposed the contradictions of the so-called American dream. The war era was the mass induction of working class women of all races into war production,